Hey, it's time for FLOSS Weekly, and today we're talking with Stefano Maffulli and Simon Phipps about the Open Source Initiative. Lots of things in the news about open source, and these guys have the scoop. You're not going to want to miss it, so stay tuned to FLOSS Weekly.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 665, recorded Wednesday, January 26th, 2022, the Open Source Initiative. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Compiler, an original podcast from Red Hat discussing tech topics big, small, and strange. Listen to Compiler on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Well, good morning or good afternoon, maybe even good evening, wherever you are. It's morning here, and it's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show all about open source software. And very fitting for that theme, today we're talking with a couple of guys from the Open Source Initiative. I'm going to go ahead and introduce my co-host, Simon Phipps. But Simon, you're doing double duty today, aren't you? Why don't you go ahead and tell us about that? Give us your disclosure for your conflict of interest for the show today.
Yes, good morning, afternoon, evening, and middle of the night. Yes, so I'm here wearing my OSI former director jacket because I was on the board of directors of OSI for nearly a decade, and one of the goals that I had while we were working out the future of OSI and how to help the open source community with it was to switch over from having the board do everything to having a staff. And the first step to that was to go and hire an executive director. And so just after I finished on the board of directors, OSI did just that and hired an executive director, who is your guest today. And because there were some things that OSI was doing that needed to carry on during the transition, I actually joined the staff, so I'm actually the director of standards and policy at OSI as well at the moment. So as well as being my successor and a colleague, Steph is also my boss and my client. So there are many kinds of conflict there that we could maybe talk about.
That's great. That'll be a lot of fun. And we will get to that. We'll talk to Stefano here in just a minute. Before we do, I do have an important announcement to make. And that is we've got to pay the bills here. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Compiler, an original podcast from Red Hat discussing tech topics, big, small, and sometimes strange. Compiler comes to you from the makers of Command Line Heroes, who is another of our sponsors. Technology can be big, bold, bizarre, and complicated, but Compiler unravels industry topics, trends, and the things you've always wanted to know about tech through interviews with the people who know it best. On their show, you will hear a chorus of perspectives from the diverse communities behind the code. Compiler brings together a curious team of Red Hatters to tackle big questions in tech like, what is technical debt? What are tech hiring managers actually looking for? And do you have to know how to code to get started in open source? Episode 2 covers things like, what can video games teach us about edge computing? The internet is a patchwork of international agreements and varying infrastructure, but there's something coming to change the way we connect. In this particular episode of Compiler, the hosts explore what edge computing could mean for people who enjoy video games and what the swarm of entertainment could teach us about the technology. Then you have episode 9, how are tech hubs changing? Traditionally, if someone wanted a career in tech, they had to make the move to one of the tech hubs, a city packed with startups and talents. But things are starting to change, and the hosts of Compiler speak to a few of the change makers who are thinking outside of the physical and social box we've come to associate with innovation. I took a few minutes and checked out one of their episodes about superstitions in tech. And it was a very thought-provoking episode about some of the things that we do that don't make any sense, some of the things we do that are best practices, and then kind of this gray area in between that are full of superstitions. Things like, have you rebooted yet? Or the problem goes away as soon as you call tech support. Real fascinating stuff there. Learn more about Compiler at red.ht/twit. New episodes are out now. Go and download them at any time. Be sure to check back for new shows. Listen to Compiler on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll also include a link to this episode's show page. My thanks to Compiler for their support. And now let's bring Stefano on. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. It's been fun and thinking about the spider web of connections that all lead back to Simon.
Yes. Simon is the shatter point for this episode, I think. Well, let's talk about the OSI. First off, I had before the show got started, we had a very fun question in the chat room, and that is, at the OSI, what layer is the nonprofit one?
Which layer will be not nonprofit?
There you go, and that's a joke about the OSI model of networking, and I got a kick out of that. But seriously, though, go ahead and kind of give us a little bit of background, the 30,000-foot view. What is OSI all about, sir?
So OSI started over 25 years ago, and with the intention of helping companies, corporations getting into the nascent open source and free software movement. Just giving my interpretation is it's just giving another angle to what the free software movement started. Two sides of the same medal, representing the fact that you must have, as a society, you must have the possibility to use the software, share it, modify it, and distribute it as you wish, without any constraints and without having to ask for permission. So it's basically enabling a permissionless evolution of a nascent field of software and computing. That was at the time.
And how long ago was
very basics of it? That was 26 years ago.
Yeah, goodness, you guys have been around for just about the whole thing, the whole ride, huh?
Yep, pretty much the whole ride. During the evil times when we were just a band of young, I would say, young revolutionaries, going around and basically telling the existing companies and corporations that their model of doing software was wrong, and and being proven right afterwards.
Yep, very good. Now, one of the things that the OSI still does is kind of moderates what exactly counts as open source, right? If I was doing some reading about this, and apparently to be able to call a license an open source license, someone has to go to you guys first as the arbitrator of that, right?
That's how we started. We started by pulling the lists of being a resource for the community to ask us, is this license, so is this software package responding to the open source definition? And we initially came up, as an organization, with that definition, coming from the Debian free software guidelines, basically, the guidelines that decide whether a package can be shipped inside the Debian operating system. We modified that with that definition, and that became the foundation of what the OSI as an institution does, as an organization does. We review licenses as they come in, as they are requested by the community for comments, and we, after deep analysis with experts in the license committee, which we can talk about, one piece of the organization, that's what we do. We maintain and provide that list of open source licenses that provide to the open source definition, that comply to the open source definition.
There's been a bit of friction in the open source community about that question, at least in the last couple of years. You had, I don't remember the name of it, but there was one license in particular that was very much a response to Amazon. The Commons Clause, I believe, is what they called it. And then there's been a couple of others. The one that comes to mind, and this is too controversial, we don't have to get into it, but there was like a persona non grata license that someone put forward, and there was quite a bit of heated discussion about that. I'm curious if you have any comments about kind of where we're at with the debate over what counts as open source.
It's been going on for more than 20 years. No, it's interesting. I don't have any problem talking about those concerns and those conversations. It is true that many challenges have come and will continue coming to the open source definition. We are as an organization, we are the stewards of the definition. We don't really have the, we're not an elected body. We don't have full authority. We have the authority that the community grants us to define open source. And recently, there have been a lot. So with the open source movement becoming so big and wide, with the wide availability of open source software in the world and making a difference, a lot of organizations and companies especially have come to challenge and growing big. They have a need to satisfy their investors. They have a need to their own stakeholders need to be satisfied in different ways. And somehow the open source definition gets dragged into these conversations and pulled and stretched. We have reviewed the two ones that you specifically mentioned, the server-side public license, commons clause, a whole new set of licenses that go into like the persona non grata, but there are others that we call them, they're called ethical licenses. Mm-hmm. These licenses, they have meaning, right to exist. They just don't, we have reviewed them and we have found that they don't obey to the open source definition. And these are not new licenses, to be honest. These are not new conversations. In over 20 plus years, we have heard multiple times of the need of some organizations and some groups to stretch and change the open source definition for their needs, because either it was Microsoft telling the governments that looking at the source code was going to be enough for the governments to identify whether there was a security issue into the code base of Microsoft Windows, for example. Or we've heard, other big corporations that don't exist anymore saying that, they were gonna, if software was always distributed with a GNU GPL license or with another free software and open source license, they would never be able to make money. And, they disappeared because they were not making money with licenses that they were removing those freedoms. So it's an ongoing debate, and we're happy to keep entertaining that.
I have to say, I'm pretty excited. I'm very happy to hear that you guys are kind of staying the course and sticking to the open source definition. Because again, as you said, these are not new issues. When open source was first codified, you can read the guys that were there as part of that conversation, and they thought through some of these things, and they came to the conclusion that no, we can't let this kind of ethics debate. And they go into some real specific examples, and they make the point that what one person considers to be ethical, another person will consider to be unethical or, morally wrong or whatever. And the source code or the license for source code is not the place to have that debate, which I think is really kind of a masterful line to draw. And as you say, we're not suggesting that, there's necessarily anything evil about some of these other licenses, even proprietary licenses. They have the right to exist, and I suppose in some cases they make sense, but that's not what open source is all about, right? Absolutely. Yeah, I remember it was one of the very first articles that I read on the GNU project, and where it was a question that someone asked to Richard Stallman about, aren't you concerned about your code being used into missiles and weapons? Why don't you do something about it? And his response, very pragmatic, was, I cannot do anything about it. even if I was gonna write a copyright license that said, you cannot use it in a weapon, someone will use it in a weapon, and for me, there will be no way to know in any case. So, it's a kind of like the argument that we've heard many times about encryption and terrorism. Like, governments want to ban encryption because it can be used by terrorists.
but at the same time, it's math. It's just, there's nothing really that can prevent any mathematician to use encryption and encode it any way they want it.
So you mentioned FSF. You mentioned FSF there, Steph. Listeners may not realize that you were one of the founders of Free Software Foundation Europe as well. I wonder how you square. I wonder how you square your status as an FSFE founder with now being OSI executive director. Are those things compatible, or have you changed?
I think it's always been compatible, but I'm not a founder of FSF Europe, but I am one of the very early joiners. I founded the Italian chapter only, which was not one of the founding chapters. That's a minor detail. Aside from that, I always thought that open source and free software are the two sides of the same medal. You can, in fact, the simpler way to describe what open source is by listing the four freedoms. It's the verbose open source principles. Nobody really can recite them off the top of their mind, and that by itself to me has always been the confirmation that we're talking about the same stuff. One group, the Free Software Foundations and FSF Europe too, they focus on the ethical aspects of software having to be free, because you must give those, because a society cannot depend, a digital society cannot avoid controlling the tools to access knowledge and share knowledge. And for us, for the open source initiative, is more of a practical term of being able to have a community of user engaging with innovation. It's more about just what angle you look at the same issue.
Right. So you did FSFE and FSFE Italia. You then went on and worked for FreedomBox, which was the project to create a home appliance that was freedom respecting. Can you tell us, was that a continuation of the same thinking, or was that a departure for you? And is it still relevant?
No, I've always been passionate, even when I worked at corporations in marketing departments as a community manager, developer advocate, and marketing community director. All of those roles, I tried to put my personal thinking into, and my personal motivation to be part of this open source movement and free software movement. I use the terms interchangeably. So for the Freedom Box, I was in between jobs, and I listened to I was at FLOSS then when Eben Moglen announced the little box, and we chatted for quite a bit. And I'm still convinced that it's not true that people don't want to run servers at home. And I think we all run with a server, and the definition of servers has changed so much in any case. That project, I think it's worthwhile. The interaction, or the way open source free software movement, the ethical aspects of it, the access to technology, privacy issues, and issues of control by the distributed power between the people, the governments, is a personal passion for me too.
Right. So this is all by way of sneaking up on a difficult question for you. But so after FreedomBox, you moved to OpenStack, which of course was the great big departure into cloud computing and open source, and was
correct.
a fascinating proprietary product that went open source. So you've gone from FSF to cloud, which many people think as the end of open source. Do you think open source is still relevant in an age of cloud and Web3, or is it just something for old people like me and almost old people like you?
Well, that's a great question, actually, because before even going into cloud, I dabbed into mobile. So I was out there looking at the surge of the various app stores first, which I thought that really bent and challenged the open source definition. Then I saw the cloud, which again put another very big dent into the open source definition, in my opinion. And third, and now I'm seeing these Web3 pieces, however you want to define them, with the blockchain, the metaverse, however you define it. That's another big piece that I think require the community to really think carefully about what the open source definition does in the context of these new technologies. I'll give an example. For mobile, open source, when the first mobile, I was working for a company called Funambul. Funambul was a leader in open source. I was a leader in open source synchronization of data across multiple devices. So this was before the iPhone came out. Before the iPhone came out, you could install of your Nokia phones and your Blackberries, you could install this synchronization tool, talk into a server, and all your contacts and your emails, calendar items will be synchronized, desktop, all across one source of truth synchronized. When the iPhone came out, we wanted to release the same client for the iPhone. And at that point, it was clear that the Affero GPL v3 was not really good enough. Like, you cannot really obey to the Affero GPL v3 to put into a store the software, because you can't really provide the corresponding source code for that. You cannot provide. We would have to reveal your keys, your private keys, to sign the executable that goes into the App Store. That in and by itself, like, I didn't, honestly, at the time, I was the one who submitted the Affero GPL v3 to OSI for approval with Funambul. And at the time, there was not enough conversation, in my opinion, to try to understand exactly the implications of App Store policies and open source. After that, with the cloud, initially it was just on someone else's computer. You know, the slogan that the FSFE also uses and used. But today there is a range of complexity where I noticed, for example, the Italian government has a huge amount of open source code released for the public administrations. And one of these pieces is a very complex system of payments. Like, you can use your mobile phone in Italy to pay for parking tickets, pay your taxes, do all sorts of interactions with very different public administrations, central and local, using this system. And it's all open source. But a lot of the functions of this code depend on cloud functions, meaning they're written in a way that they can be executed pretty much without a VM. You cannot replicate that code. So now is that open source definition, when you have functions that are simply executed by a black box, a machine that you don't control, how is that really open source? Is that really open source? Is that something that guarantees for the future of maintenance and replication of that code? Can you modify and distribute it? You sure can, but can you run it anywhere else than from the cloud where it was coded for? Like, these questions, I think, are very important, and the community is kind of not asking them enough.
I mean, it's always seemed to me as if this is really just a restatement of the tragedy of the commons anyway that we're looking at here. What cloud did was cause a whole load of people to use open source software in ways where they didn't have to respect the GPL. And the people who wrote software under the GPL were all people who expected reciprocal behavior and the propagation of their values. And it doesn't seem to me there's any solution to that. Do you think there is? Or, I mean, it strikes me that the cloud problem that AGPL was trying to solve is still the big open question. And what we've now come on to is people trying to solve it with what they call ethical licenses, licenses with field of use restricted. They're all solutions to this copyleft tragedy of the commons. Do you think there actually is a solution to this, or do you think people are trying to solve the wrong problem?
I must think that there is a solution. We cannot find it if we don't talk. If we don't talk together, if we don't really convene these minds who have a deep understanding of what open source really means at the heart, what it enables. We need to get an agreement. Like the ethical aspects of the Free Software Foundation, I think they give a very strong North Star to define what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. For the open source, we have a North Star, and that's that pragmatism of enabling the innovation to happen and to continue. We need to come to an agreement about what is acceptable and what is not. And I think that there must be a solution. It will not happen if we keep on chatting on Twitter, though. That's my that is my thing. Like I think that we need to have these conversations. These are hard. Like it's hard to think about. I don't think that the solution is the ethical licenses approach. I seriously don't, because I disagree that they can be ever enforced. Like, I don't think, I'm not a lawyer, but we talked about these issues 20 years ago. We talked about that approach 20 years ago, and that didn't work. We agreed that it didn't work. I don't see any new reasons to believe that it will work. That writing on a license that you don't want some big organization or some evil organization not to use your code is going to make a difference, unless it only makes a difference if you're big enough. But at that point, what's in it for the rest of the community?
So I want to jump in. I've got a question about what OSI does, and that is let's kind of imagine that there is an individual, a developer, or even a company out there that says, I want to really do open source right, but this thing that I'm going to build is potentially going to wind up in the cloud. Or, there's multiple different problems that one could run into trying to do something open source. And my question is the OSI set up such that someone can contact you guys and say, here's the problem I've got. Can you help me work through this in a way that makes sense in open source?
We're going there. So this is, I started only a few months ago. So at the end of Q3 in last year. And we're putting together new programs so that we can have a more solid organization that can provide more services. It's in the roadmap to enable a more stable way, a more sophisticated way, more solid way to engage with the community members who have those kind of questions. For the short term, what I think it would be the conversation to have is to engage with us directly on one-on-one, because so that we can provide guidance. We do have a partnership with a university called Brandeis. Brandeis, the team has a training program for product managers and project managers to understand better how to implement open source processes at their company, design software, design products and services around the open source definition and the open source way, and that could be one way to proceed for these companies that have that problem. But talking to us is one way of unraveling, the difficult decisions to make. because these are difficult decisions. But what I want to highlight is that every company must make difficult decisions. It's not just because they want to do. It's not a fault of open source that business models are mostly hard to implement, or that it's hard to become rich with any activity, right? Mm-hmm.
All right. Hey, I need to do a plug for TWiT here in just a second. But before I do that, I do want to let you get a plug in. We talked about contacting OSI, but what we didn't cover is how does someone do that? So if someone wants to get in touch with OSI, and then if someone wants to support, what are the places they should go to for that?
Opensource.org is our website where we have a button that says join, and you can join as an individual member. And your organization can also join as an affiliate member. So that's one way of supporting us, is by becoming an individual member. Individual members have a responsibility to elect a part of the board of directors of the OSI, and we have elections coming up. So if you want to vote, now is the time to sign up on opensource.org/join as an individual member. And as an organization, if you have a nonprofit organization, if you are a member of a nonprofit organization that supports the mission of the OSI, that's opensource.org is also a place where you can go and sign up. And if you have simple questions, if you want to reach out to me directly, you can either email me, ed@opensource.org, or use the contact form on opensource.org.
All right. Excellent. Now, I want to let everyone know about Club TWiT. You're probably already familiar with it, but if you haven't joined yet, you definitely should. And I'm going to tell you why. We have the Discord, where you can come and chat with hosts. You can interact real time during shows. We've taken some comments from there today. You have the podcast feeds for the ad-free shows. So if you're already a Club TWiT member, you're probably not even hearing this. And then the thing that I'm most excited about, you have the Untitled Linux show, which, as I have jokingly said, they let us get started and we've been too stubborn to stop. And so we have our own podcast feed now. That's right. You can go to twit.com/clubtwit and subscribe directly to the Untitled Linux show, which is a lot of fun. We do that live every Saturday afternoon. Club TWiT, man, it's only $7 a month. It's like the price of a cup of coffee, and you get way more out of it than a cup of overpriced coffee. So twit.tv/clubtwit. Join today. Get in here. Join the fun. All right. I want to turn to Simon, because you're doing double duty today. And I want to ask you about a few of these things. And, we were having this conversation just now about the AGPL and some of these things. And I remember we had a Twitter conversation back, probably a couple of years ago. And a project that I was doing, I was kind of wrestling through some of these same things. If I build this project, it's going to be, web enabled. And I don't want someone to be able to just willy-nilly take it and make a bunch of changes and not share the source. So AGPL makes sense, but at the same time, I was thinking about trying to do like a Patreon to where I can host it for someone if they're on my Patreon. Well, then you have this problem where you've got all this hosting backend that doesn't make sense as being part of the project, but the AGPL kind of forces you to reveal some of these things. And it was a sticky problem, and you helped me out with it at the time. Now that project hasn't gone anywhere yet, but maybe it will. Anyway, I want to kind of get your thoughts on this. Like, what do you see as being the future of AGPL and how we solve this problem of what you call the commons problem, where things go into the cloud and suddenly there's no give back of code?
So it's the tragedy of the commons, which is a classic thinking problem where things that are shared in common gradually get denuded because everyone takes and no one gives. And I think that thinking about it as the tragedy of the commons gives you a clue to what the solution might be. I think that the difficulty that we've had with copyleft licenses arises from the belief that a license can, in all cases, be enforced. And the difficulty we have with open source licenses is that's not true. The license can only be enforced in really very significant cases. And even then, like in the case of Hellwig v. VMware, or in the current case of SFLC, Software Freedom Conservancy versus Vizio, what we're seeing is that it's very challenging, very expensive. Ultimately, as geeks, we think that licenses ought to compile, that you should be able to take the license, work out what it means, and there should be an inevitable consequence to your actions associated with the license. But that's not true. A license doesn't compile. A license doesn't have meaning until you stand in front of a judge in a court. And what allows a software project to work isn't the enforceability of the license. It is the solidarity of the community. And the things that work for making licenses that maintain a norm of contribution back are ensuring that solidarity of the community holds, that people who don't contribute back discover that they begin to fall behind. They begin to find themselves maintaining their own fork of the code. They begin to find themselves struggling to hire staff to work on the code. Those are the things that I think are going to make a difference, rather than ever more Byzantine, complex licenses, which no matter how clever and complex they are, they still don't compile. They've still got to be in front of a judge before they make any difference. And you're not going to get there because that costs more money than you have. So I think that the key to all this is very much to do with community norms. It is to do with community governance. It is to do with community solidarity. And unfortunately, that's not really the subject that I hear being discussed in this connection. I hear people still thinking legalistically in terms of licenses and not really thinking in terms of community governance.
Well, Simon, it sounds like the Web3 is just the perfect solution for that, isn't it? You can take a license and make it compile into a smart contract. That sounds great, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I said on Twitter recently, and I stand by it, there are no smart contracts. There are only immutable programs and programmers with the hubris to believe they didn't make any mistakes. I think that it was fascinating. I was hearing an article today where people were talking about the DAO again, the Distributed Autonomous Organization. I'm old enough to remember the first DAO and the phenomenal 7-figure sum of money that the people who invested in it lost because there was a programming error in the smart contract that implemented it. And, the difficulty with all these things is if you are a techno crypto bro who believes that he, and it's always a he, is incapable of making mistakes, then you're spot on, Jonathan. But apart from those people, Web3 is probably not the answer.
Yes. As I said in the back chat, I'm about to troll Simon, and you answered that masterfully.
And it worked.
It worked.
It worked.
I'm not as adamant. I'm still waiting for the watching carefully the environment. I think that there is something interesting there, but it's really lost in the noise yet. So we'll have to wait, and I'm a wait and see approach. I'm fascinated by it though. There are some nuggets in there that seem interesting.
Moxie Marlinspike had a blog post about this, which if you're not familiar, Moxie does a lot of things. He's a security researcher. He's a programmer. He's also was for the longest time the CEO of, I believe it was Signal.
Signal.
I hope I had that right. He did a blog post where he actually wrote some code and did some experiments around the Web3 and this idea of, you can be involved in Web3 and not run any servers. And he eventually came to the conclusion that if you're not running your own server, then it's centralized and you're running on somebody else's server. And we haven't solved this problem yet. And I thought it was actually really, really quite, he got a hold of the problem really well. And I had a conversation just the other day about someone was talking about cryptocurrency and all these different things. And I was trying to make the point to them that there are some excellent ideas wrapped up in this, but nobody's done it right yet. And we're kind of all waiting for the time when somebody actually gets all the details right. And so maybe there will come a time when you actually can have a license that goes into one of these smart contracts and it makes sense. But so far, I'm actually with Simon on this, that the way things are done now, it's too easy to make mistakes and too difficult to fix your mistakes afterwards.
Yeah, well, it's one of the hardest things in computing is the distributed databases, and these guys are deeply into that problem. So that's why I'm looking at it with fascination. Like if they find a way to have distributed databases that actually work, can be relied upon, can be trusted, then we may have a next step in computing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to kind of shift to something else, because there's something that's been in the news here pretty recently that I think is right in your wheelhouse, Stefano, and that is the Vizio lawsuit. And I think we alluded to it just a moment ago, but there's a lawsuit that's kind of testing the GPL, and it's against Vizio, the makers of TVs, and it's essentially saying GPL code has gone into these TVs and they've not released anything back to the community. And what's different about this lawsuit, I should probably let you tell this story, but I'll give you my understanding of it first, then you can correct the details. What's different about this lawsuit is it's not the programmers that hold the copyright that are bringing suit. Because this is an important question when you talk about standing, whether someone really even has the right to bring the lawsuit forward. The group that's doing it, the Software Freedom Conservancy, is bringing the lawsuit as a user of the TV. And they're trying to test, among other things, whether they have standing. And I'm curious, I assume you've been watching this story and what you think about it. Are they going to succeed, do you think?
Well, I hope so. It's definitely a new approach, something that historically the Free Software Foundation interpretation and Eben Moglen's interpretation of the GPL was that it was not a contract. And I was trained to think that the GPL is not a contract. It's not something that you must approve or that you have to sign upon. But it looks like, by having conversations with different lawyers, that that's just an interpretation and it's not the mainstream interpretation. So licenses and free software license, open source licenses are contracts, and therefore the contract is between us as users. We have rights, and not just the copyright holders. So this is what this lawsuit is testing, this theory, and if it's successful, then we will have, as society, we will have a very powerful tool to get those rights, and to kind of what Simon was saying. The social contracts, the social agreements between the users of the software, developers, will be more clear. There will be more parity in there, balance of powers. And if it doesn't succeed, well, we go back to square one. We go back to where we were. So I don't see a way for this to be, massive problem, but it's definitely a very interesting challenge, and good on the Software Freedom Conservancy for having the courage to move on.
Yeah, for sure. I do want to turn to Simon for just a moment, and as our guest, ask what exactly are you up to at OSI these days? What keeps you busy there? What secret projects are you working on?
Oh, it's terribly secret. One of the things we discovered in, let's take you even further back. Back at the beginning of the 2000s, there were a lot of open source and free software people who believed that software patents were going to be the end of the software industry. And that was largely expressed in the form of companies that depend on patent royalties to monetize their investment in standards. They have what are called standards essential patents, or SEPs, and there are companies like Ericsson or Phipps or Qualcomm the majority of whose revenue actually comes from royalties on standards essential patents rather than selling products. And so that was largely settled in 2005 with a thing called the Open Standards Requirement for Open Source Software, or OSR. You'll find that at opensource.org/OSR if you're interested in it. And for about a decade, the issue of software patents and open source was largely not discussed. And then in 2017, OSI was told about an increasing trend in standards organizations for some of those SEP-dependent companies to try and redefine open source as allowing patents to be monetized through the source code that was under open source licenses. Now, obviously, under licenses like the Apache license or the GPL v3, that's impossible. And so those SEP-dependent companies demonized that kind of open source under copyleft licenses. But we realized at OSI that it was going to be important that we engaged in this argument to, first of all, to help standards organizations realize that open source isn't just a phrase describing code being somehow open in a descriptive sense, but rather it's the name of a term of art that's recognized globally by software developers as meaning that it's a body of software where negotiation will not be mandatory for them to be able to use it. And so since 2017, I've been working with what are called de jure, so a formal standards organizations, to try and help them understand that open source is a term of art and is already defined. And OSI had to join one of the preeminent open standards organizations, an organization called ETSI, because they wouldn't let us talk to them without being a member. So I sit on at ETSI. And we also engage at ISO and CEN-CENELEC and DIN, the German standards body, BSI, the UK standards body. And we're trying to be as helpful as possible to standards organizations to help them not be tempted into attempting to redefine open source as meaning open apart from the patents.
Yeah, you reminded me, Simon, the days of the MP3 and the MPEG wars.
They're not over. WebRTC H.264, H.265. We still have those same problems. Yeah. I'm curious then, are groups like the Open Invention Network kind of tied in to this same fight?
So OIN is still heavily involved in this particular battle, but what's actually going on is an attempt to gaslight all of us into believing that open source never meant to prevent the use of patents in connection with software. And so we find at open standards organizations, companies that I won't name, but they know that they know who I'm talking about as I mention them, and they're watching this. Companies that are trying to gaslight us into believing that the MIT and BSD trustees never intended their licenses to also apply to patents. And they gaslight us into believing that they even have the temerity to say that Richard Stallman didn't intend patents to be unusable, and that Bruce Perrins didn't intend them to be usable. At OSI, we partly resolved that by Bruce Perrins was actually our representative at ETSI for a year. And Bruce very solidly disabused them of the view that patents were okay. But OIN is at a different part of the problem, because OIN is dealing with the flow of patents through the economy, whereas these organizations are organizations that create standards like Codex standards, and they place technologies into the standard during their design, which are intentionally placed there to be monetizable through patents. And the standards organizations allow them to do that. They encourage them to do that. They have a process that makes it easy for them to do that. And those organizations then discover that the market they're trying to work in is a market where patents are not considered the norm. It's a market where implementation is king rather than specification. And in that market, they want to creep up behind us all and tell us that we should be paying patent royalties after all. And that isn't really a problem OIN is going to deal with, because none of these companies are members of OIN and they never will be. The OIN is dealing with a different problem of keeping peace between the members of the open source community. And at that job, it's doing an amazing job. I mean, pretty much every company that deals in open source software is now a member of OIN. If you wanted to bring up a patent lawsuit and you were a patent holder, you would discover that pretty much everybody else's patents in the whole world were being used in court against you. And so you probably wouldn't even bother trying.
One of the challenges, from what I understand with OIN, is it is specifically about Linux, right? And so is there kind of a challenge there that everyone has gotten on this bandwagon for things related to Linux, but there's a bigger world out there than just Linux? I mean, there are, well, we talked about WebRTC. I would almost think that one of the challenges is that is not under the purview of OIN, right?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as to say that. The OIN protects something that is called the Linux system definition, and they regularly update the Linux system definition to include all of the technologies you would expect to find in an overall Linux system. And those technologies include things like LibreOffice. So LibreOffice is included in the Linux system definition, and LibreOffice on whatever platform you're running it is included in the protection that OIN brings. When you look at the Linux system definition, you'll find that these days it's incredibly broad. It includes Java, for example. So OpenJDK is there in the Linux system definition. LibreOffice is in the Linux system definition. Yeah. And as a consequence, the protection OIN offers is extremely broad and covers pretty much all the software that the average software developer is using, as long as it isn't mobile software.
Right.
That's quite the big carve out there.
Yeah, there's a bit of a carve out there for mobile software. Yeah.
Oh, all right. Well, Stefano, I want to turn back to you and ask what is next. We covered some history. We've covered some things going on right now. What's next for OSI?
Very next thing is the elections. So we're going to have elections in March, and we're currently all very busy making sure that we have a solid election, and we're going to be electing 2 new individual members, directors, and two representatives for the affiliate members. After that, one of the things that we want to do is to focus on the practical aspects of open source. Like you mentioned before. You mentioned before the fact that we want to we want to dive deeper into issues that developers find, that the community finds in general, not just developers, but also corporations, companies, and the challenges that they have when they go into implementing open source projects. And there are a couple of aspects that we want to dive a little bit deeper. And starting from my experience with mobile and cloud, the fact that open source kind of did not have a very solid conversations about these topics, we want to dive deeper into 2 new topics of interest. One is the interaction of open source and the open source definition with things like the Web3, the distributed databases, the blockchain and distributed ledgers, because those tools, they are introducing new concept. They introduce artificial scarcity inside the digital world. So I think we got the sense with the board, we had this conversation, we got the sense that we should discuss the implications for open source in this world. And another very interesting topic that I think is even more important is the interaction, what happens with open source and machine learning and AI. In that field, there is a very interesting mix of what is of data and the data that trains a model, and the model goes into the software. So the boundary between what is data, what is software, what is functional data, what is just inert data, what is just a picture, and what is a picture that can train a piece of software to understand whether that picture corresponds to or represents a cat or the face of a person or, recognize an individual. That conversation is something that we need to have, I think, with the community. So in the next months, you will see us talking more about this topic and sparking some deeper conversations in terms of maybe we're probably going to have an event before the end of the year where we will discuss these things and maybe come up with some plans and thoughts that are solid and that can be referenced by the community in the future.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. What does an open source machine learning model look like? Because, as you say, there's multiple components to that. But if you leave one of the components out, you don't really have a machine learning model anymore. You just you have parts that don't do anything until you put all of them together. That's really interesting. So you also have a lot of people asking questions about people that are not familiar with it use the term algorithms, which in some cases is accurate, but a lot of times it's machine learning models that get used at places like Twitter and Google, YouTube, Facebook. And these things, they impact us in ways that we don't necessarily realize. Things from as trivial as, I know one of the things people complained about was Twitter had an automatic photo zoom and it was treating different people differently. And, I don't make the case that is a moral problem. I think that's looking at it the wrong way, but I think it is a code problem. It's a bug and it should be treated that way. And, as we all know, open source is one of those things that shines the light on the bugs. So I think that's going to be super important going forwards for, a lot of the things that we're trying to deal with as a society is seeing if we can apply these principles of open source to machine learning. I'm excited about that. I'm looking forward to what you guys come up with.
Wonderful. Yeah. No, I mean, it's even more than that, because if you go and start looking deeper, you realize that there are courts in the United States that have algorithms. Now, we don't know what kind of sophistication they have behind that decide whether someone like an inmate, someone who's in jail, is worth of being given parole and be able to come out free. So these algorithms are black boxes and they decided about life of a person. And we don't know how to expect it. I mean, that's a separate conversation, maybe. In fact, the Electronic Frontier Foundation is more interested in it, but it shows how the implications of these algorithms are profound, a lot more profound than just the Twitter feed or the Facebook feed.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we are about out of time and we need to wrap. We've talked a little bit about blockchain. One of our Doc calls it a control question. Do you have anything else to say about blockchain?
As I said, to me, it's a very fascinating field. I was hoping that after almost 10 years of existence, there would be right now at least some hint, some suggestion of what could be a killer app. It isn't yet, and now we have also discovered the energy consumption is really intolerable. I really think that proof of work and the way Bitcoin is wasting energy to prove something that really has no meaning should be rethought. That approach. But aside from that, I think that there is a nugget of interesting in the technology itself, like the distributed databases approach, the DAO as a concept, the fact that we really, the system that we have right now and as a society of banks and the way money runs and all that is bogus, is broken, is not really serving any purpose right now, if you think about it deeply. So we ought to have that conversation, and we ought to think about solving, putting solutions out rather than just, pointing fingers at Bitcoins or ridiculousness of the NFTs and their JPEGs and animated PNG and GIFs. There is something interesting though.
I've half jokingly pointed out that I believe the killer app of the blockchain is already here, and it's called Git. There may actually be some deeper point to that, because you talk about proof of work and some of these different things. In a manner of speaking, Git already has a lot of that solved. So I don't know, maybe that should be the model that we look at to try to make all of this make sense. But anyway, we don't have time for that. Different topic. Stefano, I do want to ask, because we get hate mail if we don't. What is your favorite programming language, scripting language, and text editor?
I write, well, since I'm not a programmer, I probably cannot answer that question in a reliable way. Like I have written some code in JavaScript, Java, Python, and Bash. I've used VI and Emacs. I stopped using Emacs when I realized that the more I learned about shortcuts, I forgot also phone numbers, and tells you a little bit about how old I am. Where I had to memorize phone numbers. So I rarely used Emacs, but text editor, whatever I can write something in, works. Usually it's my email. I use that as a task list manager.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Simon, you're kind of a guest here. I'm going to ask you the same two questions. What is your favorite scripting language and text editor these days?
So my favorite text editor is whatever text editor is on the box that I'm using.
Fair enough.
So on my Chromebook at the moment, there is a program called Text, and I run that up and edit. I like my text editors to not do anything other than let me edit text, and consequently, I have something of a bias against Emacs, which is an operating system as far as I'm concerned.
If only it had a decent text editor.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, the next thing is to try and write a text editor in Emacs. I don't know if it's possible. But, in terms of programming languages, these days I don't do a massive amount of programming, and what I do tends to be JavaScript, and I don't like it. So at the moment, I probably don't have a favorite programming language. It used to be Pascal, though. My first love was Pascal. I used to write compilers in Pascal. It was the systems programming language on Convergent Technologies engines, which were the first computers I professionally worked on when I was with Burroughs Machines. So it would have to be Pascal and whatever editor is on the machine I'm using.
All right. I like it. Thank you guys both for being here, particularly Stefano. Thank you for coming and chatting with us. I had a great time talking to you, got some insight into what's going on at OSI. Thank you, sir. And we'll have you back, I'm sure, at some point.
Thank you. Anytime.
All right. Simon, what do you think?
Well, time will tell. Obviously, I have to say nice things about Steph because he is my manager. He's doing a tremendous job and he deserves a pay rise, and I hope the board are watching. But I mean, OSI continues to be amazingly relevant for such a small organization. It's had an amazingly large, quiet influence over the last 20 years. And I think this is a turning point for it at the moment. So I'm very excited to have Steph on board. And I hope he's going to be able to help us take the transition into a staffed organization providing the services that are needed to, open source isn't, sometimes people contrast OSI and FSF by saying that FSF is the ethical one and that OSI is the pragmatic one. And that's kind of true, but OSI is very much an organization that uses its strong ethical foundation to guide its pragmatic decisions. And I think that we still need that at this time when we're seeing people still believing that licenses ought to compile. I mean, I'm aghast at the view that people think that they can write a license which is going to force the behaviors of others. And they are then basing a whole social program on the idea they can write a license that forces other people's behaviors. I'm hoping OSI will be able to bring together a force that will change tech for the better in the future and overcome the imbalances of an over-reliance on legalism on the one hand and an over-reliance on opportunism on the other hand, which seem to me to be the two forces that are driving apart the tech industry and leaving it to be eaten by Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so on.
Yeah, it's tempting to fall into this mindset that, open source is a solved problem. But the conversation today, and of course other news stories over the last few months, really kind of reinforced that no, this technology is still an evolving landscape. Things are still happening, and there are still some outstanding problems that people are working on and trying to fix. So I know I am at least glad to get to talk to both you and Stefano, to know that there is some solid leadership looking at these problems. And it sounds like you guys are doing your best to have your heads screwed on straight, because there are definitely some weeds to get lost into.
Yes, every day there are new opportunities to go off track and to get screwed up instead of having the head screwed on right.
Yes. All right. Well, let's talk about what's coming up next week. We are talking with Rob Legesse. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that. And what do you know? He's talking about corporations and open source. That'll be interesting, I'm sure. And then after that, we have scheduled Ramon Hubrodo, who is from CodeC, and that'll be interesting to talk to what he's got going on there. I want to let you know that you can find me over at hackaday.com, especially the security column goes live every Friday morning. And then also, don't forget to check out the Untitled Linux show. Get on Club Twit and join us live, and then check us out on the feed. Simon, do you have anything you want to plug?
I'd like to remind everybody that they really must immediately go to opensource.org/join and join OSI, where it is completely free of charge unless you choose to join at a level that involves paying us money. And I'd also just like to remind all the people who have been meaning to go to patreon.com/webmink and become one of my patrons, that now would be a fantastic time for them to do so, just before the month end and just before I post the message about this show on Patreon.
I will also point out for everyone listening to the audio and not watching the video, Simon has framed just perfectly above his hands there a sign that says "Follow at Webmink maybe." So you can keep up with him on Twitter at Webmink, and you can keep up with me on Twitter at JP_Bennett. Not that I post a whole lot there, but I try to keep it technical and free from political diversions. I think that is it for today. Doc Searles will be back next week, and make sure to check that out. But we'll see you next time on FLOSS Weekly.
So you got yourself the brand new latest and greatest iPhone or Samsung smartphone because you heard about all of the beautiful photography those things can create, but for some reason you're just not quite getting it done when you try to make your photos. Or you got yourself a brand new camera because you were interested in getting started in photography, but your little new inexpensive camera still isn't quite cutting it. Well, you need to check out my show, Hands-on Photography, here on TWiT. I'm going to show you how to be a better photographer and a better post-processor, and quite frankly, just help you get the most out of that new camera that's either on your phone or the brand new one that you just got for your birthday or gifts or what have you. And it's going to be a lot of fun. So head on over to twit.tv/hop. That's twit.tv/HOP and subscribe today.